everyone, and welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole for this week. This week we're back on Dresden plates. So I'm going to show you another quilt you probably won't have seen. Everybody sort of, if you've followed me for any length of time, knows the Dotty for Dresden quilt, which was my first one. This is another Dresden plate quilt. I've made a lot of them. This quilt, I don't actually remember what the name of it is. I'll have to look it up. But it was made the first time I went to teach at Quiltcon, which was in 2009. And I was asked to make this quilt, or a quilt, for the Quiltcon magazine. And this is the quilt that I made, and it was in the magazine, oh gosh, I guess it was the year after that. Maybe it was that year. No, I think it was the year after it. I really should look it up, shouldn't I? But I wanted to kind of revisit that Dotty for Dresden quilt. I guess that Quiltcon was a new audience for me. It was modern quilters. It was just a little bit different than anywhere else I'd taught, or anyone had taught really. It was a very new concept. And so I thought I would go back to something I'd done before, but kind of rework it a little bit. So we've got the full Dresden plates over here. They have a lot more wedges in them than the Dotty for Dresden plates. These are done in quarters, and from memory I think there's 24 in these, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that works in a minute. So these have, I really should have counted before we started rolling, I think there's 24 wedges in that, and you can see that it has a very big space in the centre. So where Dotty for Dresden, the centre circle is probably more about this size, this is a big circle, and I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about that. And then I also have these half Dresdens here, and I'm going to talk to you about how you could get that done too, and some little quarter Dresdens up in the corners. This has been hand quilted, and it's not a pattern that I ever released separately to that Quiltcon magazine. It was only ever published there, and so it has been very well loved and used in other ways on the couch and all that sort of stuff, because it didn't ever have to go off and earn its keep. A lot of the time after I've made my show quilts and my book quilts, they have to then go and hang in shows, and they have to be taught in classrooms, and they have to be loaned out to shops, and so they're kept very carefully. This one has been scrumpled up and crawled underneath and all of that sort of thing. It's hand quilted with pearl cotton. This is all hand appliqued down. It's obviously my initials, and from memory the pattern had all of the alphabet so that you could put your own initials and the year into it as well. I really liked the idea that I had the spots, the different spots, even though they're not quite reverses of each other. And I also liked this sashing, because it kind of separated everything out and made it slightly different than the Dresden, in that it's blocks but it's not blocks. So the way that this is put together is actually a big strip of fabric in this direction and a great big square, and the sashing ends underneath here, and then there's a border, and then obviously the block in the center. So it's a really easy construction, just with the Dresdens popped on the top. If anyone's interested, I'll do a pattern for it. I'll find the pattern. I'm sure it's still there somewhere in my archives if anyone would like to make it. However, I am going to, there's been so much interest in my Dresden situation and a Dresden tutorial. I'm actually going to film a whole class about using wedge rulers, about wedges of all kinds, Dresden's obviously being part of that, so I'm looking to do that probably in the middle of the year. It'll be available sort of May, something like that. Don't hold me to that. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I like to make my Dresdens. And you've seen the Dotty for Dresden Dresdens, you've seen these Dresdens, which have a few more on the out, a few more wedges and the big inside. Here's another example. I love Dresdens, and I've made them a lot. This is one that I did for my little Dolly's online program a couple of years ago. This is what I call a dolly quilt, or a quilt for the size of a doll. And these little wedges are teeny tiny. So they're done exactly the same way. It's just that they're tiny, tiny little things, and they're made from a teeny tiny little tumbler template, which is a lot of good fun as well. And really, although they're tiny, you would think they're so much more difficult to make. Absolutely any kind of Dresden can be made using the technique I'm going to show you right now. Okay, now both these are wedge rulers. The Dotty for Dresden quilt is made using a 22.5 degree wedge, which is this shape. And that means you have 16 wedges in the circle. The one I just showed you, I just counted when we stopped the camera, it has 22. So it is even a different shape of any of these. They can come in just about any wedge shape that you like in order to make a Dresden, so long as when they're all put together, it makes up to 360 degrees. So this one here is a much thinner wedge. It's a 10 degree wedge and it would have 36 blades in the circle. So pretty much what you do is you go, okay, this is 10 degrees, there's 360 degrees in a circle, divide that by 10 is 36, so there's 36 wedges. That's how it works out. Then obviously you've got to worry about things like seam allowances and all of those sorts of things. But when they're all stitched together, they need to make up 360 degrees so that it forms a circle. Pretty simple concept. So in order to make them, this is to make a pointy wedge. So a wedge that has a pointed top on it, like this. You can also have curved wedges, you can have flat wedges, you can have all sorts of different things. If you cut all of your wedges like this with a flat top and sew them all together, you will get a circle. It'll be a blocky sort of circle, and they're often called a cartwheel when they're stitched together like that, but that will work as well. So they don't need to have a point on them. You can also get Dresden wedges that have circles on the top. So when I do my class that I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the circle tops. I'm going to talk about slightly pointed, more pointed tops that make a flower. I'm going to talk about the pointed tops, and then I'm going to talk about these wedge rulers and all of the other things that you can do with them, because you don't just have to make Dresden plates with them. There are a million other things that you can do with a wedge ruler. So today I'm just going to talk to you about that 22.5 degree ruler. These are for sale at my website, and if you buy the Dotty for Dresden set, you will have the exact shape in there in order to make these. There's a template set that goes with the Dotty for Dresden pattern. You can obviously do that without it, but you know, that's up to you. So I have a strip. I'm going to cut these at 4.5 inches. It's just a random number. It's just what I've cut, what I've decided to cut. You can cut them at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Doesn't really matter. It's up to you. What happens is that the wedge, when you stitched it, will be around about 1/4 inch smaller than the wedge that you cut, okay, because we're going to stitch a seam allowance along the top. Now, to get that circle bigger in the center, like I talked about, if you want a really tiny little circle, you can cut it right at the bottom, and then the circle in the middle will be smaller. If you cut it, say, here, then you'll have a larger circle like this. If you cut it all the way down here, you'll have a much bigger circle. So the wedges that I cut for the quilt that I showed you on the wall were cut right up the thick end of the ruler, and that gave me a much bigger circle in the center of my Dresden. So these ones I've cut, let me just double check that, make sure I'm telling you the right thing. Yes, I cut them on the 1 inch line of the ruler just to give it, you know, just so I could show you the difference. And essentially what you would do in order to cut your wedges out is to keep turning the ruler in this direction. Don't flip it, turn it up and down like that, and make sure you've always got it on the same level in the center to make your circle. So long as they're all cut with the same angle of ruler and the same length at the bottom here, then you're always going to get a similar result. So in order to stitch them together in a circle. So that's how you cut them out. Once you have them all cut, you're going to fold them in half lengthwise. Be as accurate as you can, and I like to give them a little finger press like that up the center. If you wanted to, you could press them all, I suppose, but you really don't need to. And you've got that little crease there. And then you're going to take them to the sewing machine and stitch across the top here with a 1/4 inch seam. And when you stitch them, you can do a whole chain of them like this, but do make sure you leave yourself a decent amount of thread in between, because they're all going to get cut apart, obviously, and then that's all that's going to hold that together until you stitch the circle down. So just make sure and give yourself a decent little amount. Now, I did these yesterday, so my crease has fallen out a little bit. Here's my crease. And in a second, I'm going to tell you why it's important. So we're going to flip this through to the other side. And then I'm going to use a point turner and just very, very carefully poke that. This is a little bit sharp, this point turner, but it'll do. Chopstick or something like that is also very good. Push that out as far as you can. And then our crease down the middle, you're going to make sure that you line up the seam here with that crease down the center, and then you go and press them all at the iron. Now, the reason that's important is that if you don't have that accurate, your wedge could possibly be like this. That's, you know, being over the top. But imagine then that you try to sew all of these together and you're sewing them down this line here, and these lengths are all going to be different if you don't have that exact. So it's very important to make sure that you line that center seam up with that center crease that we made down the middle of all of the wedges. And you take them to the ironing board and give them all a good press. Now, after you've done that, I'll show you on this one, you're going to stitch them all together into a quarter. Do not be tempted to stitch all of them all together in one go. So if there's 16 wedges, don't just stitch them all around in a circle, because it's actually quite difficult to get a perfect circle if you do that. It's much, much easier. So you start at the top here. I've done a little stop start at the top and just stitched all the way to the bottom. This is the point that matters the most. So make sure that this point adds up perfectly. If you've been slightly not perfect at the bottom and they're out of whack a little bit, it won't matter so much because you cover those with the circle afterwards. So your circle is going to come up here probably. When you cut a circle out, you don't want it to be right down on there because you've got to, you know, tuck all your seams in and what have you. So you're going to lose at least a 1/4 inch, if not more, in there to hide any end that's not perfect. So make sure that these add up. Press them all to one side. And then when you've got 4, you are going to make sure that they add up to 90 degrees. See that? So your 4 in an arch should be perfectly 90 degrees. If you've done that, then you can go back and sew your quarters together, and then you should have a perfectly flat Dresden plate. If you sew them all around in a circle, you'll often find that when you try to stitch it together, these pleats in the center here all happen, and you end up having to sort of iron everything over the top of each other. If you check your quarters each time, you'll have no problems at all. Sew them together into a full circle and you're done. Now, the nice thing about making Dresdens this way, there are obviously a lot of different ways that you can make them, but this is the way that I like the best for pointy Dresdens, because you have your seam allowance here at the back already turned under in order for you to applique this down. So you can now glue this onto a background. If you've used something that's got an even number of wedges in it, then you can match the points or the divots up with the 1/4 of a block in order to get it in the center of a block. Otherwise, press your block into a 1/4 and get it all down on the background. I like to use applique glue, so Roxanne or something like that, a couple of little dots, and then hand stitch around the outside. You can also very easily do a blind machine stitch around the outside, or stitch just with your normal machine just inside the edge all the way around with a contrasting thread, and you'll have a nice little sort of border on it. And the nice thing about that is if it's slightly up from the edge, if your seam's in here and you've got that edge on it, it doesn't matter because that seam is already turned underneath there for you. So that's how I like making Dresdens. Some of the quilts I'm going to talk about in the future, I've used a lot of Dresden plates in things like my Hanging Lanterns quilt. If you want to see that, you can go to my website, and I'll be talking about that in the future. But there are lots of different things I've used Dresden wedges for. I absolutely love them and I use them a lot. And this is my favourite way of making them. So I hope you've enjoyed the little tutorial today, and there will be a much bigger class coming in the future.